I have a mission, a reason why my company exists. What are all the things I need to do the thing? And assets are part of it, systems are part of it, but so are people. So are
Mm,
resources. Power coming out of the wall, chemical supplied for my chemical treatment operation in the water facility, right? What happens if I don't have any more chemicals to treat the water? Well, then I can't treat the water, right? I got to have power, I got to have water, I have people, I have the third parties, I have other processes, I have other functions, enabling functions to support my critical functions.
Welcome to Securing the Future podcast with your hosts Jesse Meadors and Ramin Lamei, where we discuss the latest cutting-edge technologies and how they are affecting the security industry. This is the show where industry expertise meets in-depth discussions.
Welcome back, everyone. We are excited for another episode of Securing the Future podcast. As always, I'm your host, Jesse Meadors, and my trusty co-host, Ramin Lamei.
What's up, everyone?
And today we are pleasured to have Tony Turner as one of our guests on the podcast. Tony, welcome, man. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Jesse and Ramin. Glad to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're going to dive into the topic of operational technology and IT security and kind of the merge of those two areas and really defining the domain a little bit more, looking into things like secure by design. Tony has really an incredible background in this area, kind of a security generalist, 25 plus years of cybersecurity experience, about 15 of those in IT security, has had his share of incidents that he's responded to in the past. But the last 10 years has been really heavily focused on servicing kind of the industrial control system, manufacturing, critical infrastructure type customers. He currently runs a company called OpsWright and has a proprietary software he's helped to build that really provides better visibility. And I'll have you kind of talk more about that maybe towards the end, probably not doing a good justice of what you guys do with the software. But yeah, no, we're really excited because Tony and I kind of met a while back. He actually founded B-Sides Orlando. Got my shirt on today, so representing. I really enjoy B-Sides, and they do a phenomenal job here in Orlando. And Tony's a local, probably one of our few guests that's local to where I am here in Orlando, Florida. So Tony, I guess I'll kick it off. We'd like to jump right into our topics here and define maybe understanding OT and the difference between kind of IT security and operational. So can you explain the key differences and why securing OT is becoming so increasingly important and also kind of a blind spot a lot of times for many security leaders?
Yeah, sure thing, Jesse. So OT and IT, I think the differences are starting to kind of, we're starting to see this kind of merge over time, but OT is really about controlling physical processes, physical systems, physical outcomes. You think of things like water pumps and filtration and door locks and like think about like a prison, like the computerized system that like opens all the prison doors in the movies where like somebody controls the prison doors and like all the prisoners escape, right? Like that's an OT system that controls that, right? HVAC systems, building management systems, electric power dams, like all of this is OT that controls all that. And obviously a lot of your manufacturing processes. I think most of us are pretty familiar with IT in general, so I won't try to define what IT is, but you know, all those computers that make our lives work, right? The big differences, I will say, number one comes down into the form of consequences, right? When an IT system fails, it's not a great day. Maybe we lose some money, but people generally aren't dying. When an OT system fails, depending on the mission, the purpose of that OT system, we can have catastrophic outcomes for the downstream services and processes that rely on that OT system to function. For instance, if a water filtration system fails, or perhaps maybe the chemical mixture is wrong and water supplies get poisoned, the entire community can get poisoned, sick, and perhaps even suffer fatalities, right? Like, you're not typically going to see that from an IT controlled system, right? So like that's the number one thing that kind of jumps out at me as like a huge difference between IT and OT is the consequences, which also speaks to the criticality of these systems and why they're so important. But I will say that traditionally, OT has been much more proprietary in nature. I think that's starting to change. We're starting to see a reduction and kind of normalization of the protocols and technologies in place as we start connecting more and more systems to IT, and that kind of digital transformation of OT over time. Some of these proprietary things are going away. But if you look back at like systems that were designed 20 or 30 years ago, many of which are still running today, which is another big issue, is like just the legacy footprint of OT. Many of those systems were built, custom engineered to work in this specific facility for these specific processes, these specific functions that they're trying to execute on, right? But but again, that legacy footprint, right, means that our opportunities to secure that environment, you mentioned secure by design, the rabbit's kind of out of the hat on a lot of these systems. And we have limited opportunities to introduce security in meaningful ways for what they call brownfield environments, right? So.
And Tony, one of the key differences between IT and OT are usually OT devices are on like a closed circuit, right? So they're not usually on the internet directly, right? They may be
Correct.
indirectly and as part of like someone's network. But then that's where IoT comes in as well, right? As you get some more new modern devices that you're actually putting directly on the internet, that could potentially be some kind of instrument or some kind of physical action that they're doing as well, right? How does IoT fit into the world that you see out there?
So I see IoT and really industrial IoT kind of sitting kind of in the middle, kind of at the perimeter of where OT and IT tend to converge. So even if it's not on the internet, we see some of these systems internally interfacing with the IT environments. But definitely for like when we have like field devices or things that are deployed into the cloud, a lot of times are using IoT devices for that cloud exposure. I will say that a lot of what you see, like we're starting to see this push to like cloud specifically, right? Like putting more of this infrastructure, more of these environments in the cloud, which causes a lot of concern for a lot of people. But one of the things that we need to remember here is like, for instance, if you think of the terms for instance, like SCADA, the supervisory control data acquisition. There's a data acquisition and monitoring piece of that, and then there's a control piece of that. It doesn't mean that we're going to put control in the cloud, right? But maybe we're going to put monitoring functions in the cloud, right? There's a lot.
Yeah.
Granted, we may reveal some information that maybe we really shouldn't, but if we limit an adversary's ability to influence and use that information in meaningful ways, the risk is not as great as if we, offer someone the ability to change the chemical mixture in a water plant and put that on the internet and just let people have unauthenticated access to that. That would be really bad. But providing information about pH levels and chemical levels and things like that, still not great, but not as catastrophic, right? So
Right.
We start to see some of that as well.
To your point, IoT, there's a lot of new, especially as technology converges or evolves, right? We're seeing a lot more sensors and kind of like collecting of data show up in IoT world. To your point, the risk of these devices being hacked individually, there's less, right? So at least from the use cases we know today, but in the future, imagine cars, right? I don't know if cars you would consider IoT or OT, depending on who the manufacturer is and what they're creating, but those things can have real impact, right? If you start changing some of those inputs, right? And then it'll change the behavior of the car, right?
Yeah,
For example,
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And automotive is really kind of an interesting industry to speak to, just because they're, like, culturally speaking, safety has become really kind of core for automotive, and it really is core to OT. And like when we talk about the difference between IT and OT, one of the things that I always like to talk about, especially in security terms, like IT security people are focused. Number one, yes, we have a confidentiality, integrity, availability triad, right, in IT security. But let's be honest, most of the time we're really laser focused on confidentiality, securing data, right, encrypting data, making sure that we have good access controls in place. And yes, integrity is important. And yes, availability is very important. As we just saw with the CrowdStrike incident, availability is super important, right?
Super important. Oh yeah.
But by and large, if you look at most security controls, and where most CISOs are getting really upset about things, it's largely focused on we have to secure our data, right? That's where the compliance regimes are kind of pushing us. The reality is If you look in the OT space, confidentiality is the least important of those things. It may be the most important on the IT side. It's the least important on the OT side. We need to have good operational security. I got a good OpSec. And this is one of the reasons why we're starting to see more threats impacting and more targeting of OT, because OpSec is getting worse. And what I mean by that is, as we move away from proprietary technologies to more standardized protocols, there's globally a better understanding of how all of these OT systems work. And so with the advent of whether it's a Metasploit module or exploit code or just better understanding of OT, the attack surface is getting bigger because we're connecting to IT. And the ability to influence that attack surface is growing as well, because we have better understanding of these technologies, as well as more tooling and everything that affords us these abilities to go after this. But when we think about what is most important to OT, availability is number one. And they don't even think in terms of the CIA triad. Like most of the time, you may have some people that will reverse the letters and they'll say OT is AIC versus CIA because it's availability, then integrity, then confidentiality and order. But a lot of folks have adopted like different models of looking at this. For instance, I hear things like safety and reliability and productivity. These are the things, it's more an operationally driven mindset in the OT space as opposed to IT. Less focus on data security and these kinds of things. On the OT side, it's all about what do we do? What is our critical function? What is our mission, right? That cannot fail, and no one has to get hurt. No one gets hurt, right? Like life safety is number one. Like they actually, in most critical infrastructure organizations, they start every meeting with like a 5-minute safety moment at like the start of every meeting. Like it doesn't matter if it's related to anything related to technology or anything. Like we could be having an accounting meeting and they start the first 5 minutes of the meeting with a safety minute. It's that endemic to their culture, and it plays out throughout like the OT organization as well. And to your point, automotive is a really great example of that. If you look at like a lot of the compliance requirements that are coming down, if you look at like ISO 21434 and some of the other cybersecurity controls that are coming into automotive, most of them, and you see this in healthcare too, most of those are predicated upon life safety. That's what's driving, that requirement is what's driving those cybersecurity controls.
Well, it poses an interesting question then to me. How is IT maybe almost becoming like a threat vector to operational technology, right? Because more OT is now integrated into IT. And as you just mentioned, there's definitely a thought process that's very different in the way that IT security and the way that OT sees security. So how are you seeing that like maybe friction of the convergence happening, and what's maybe the future solutions to kind of build better convergence safely?
Yeah, so and this is a very complex topic, and there's a lot of people that are kind of, a lot of us are living this day in and day out. And the reality is getting better cooperation between IT and OT is the path forward. But the reality is IT is a threat, and it's probably the most credible threat to OT environments. Think about the scenario where very common IT security issue where someone gets phished and the machine gets compromised. Okay, one of the things that like I've had a lot of conversations with people around this whole topic of like security awareness training and the effectiveness of security awareness training, and my personal thought is it's a good thing to do, but I tend to take an assume failure or assume breach stance on pretty much anything and everything that I do, and I assume that someone's going to click the link. Like, yeah, we might do great training. Maybe only one person clicks the link instead of 10 people click the link, but someone's going to click the link. Someone's going to get compromised. Yeah. What now, right? And so now right. I've turned an extra, essentially, a malicious insider threat, right? Now they're inside my environment. They can do things. Well, what can they do? Like, if they can pivot into the OT environment from the IT environment, we have a problem, right? Mm-hmm. And this is where things like good access control and network segmentation and things like domain trusts, like OT really should not be using the same domain that IT uses. And if they have a separate Active Directory domain, we need to have a one-way trust in place there, not a bidirectional trust. Like we really need to think about like the movement, like trust directionality and data movement. By and large, most of the time, we want data to come out of OT into IT because we need it for monitoring, right?
Right.
Management needs this information, right? Like I'm not saying there should be no connectivity at all ever. That would, in a perfect world, everything would be completely air gapped. But I think most of us that work in this space know that the air gap is a lie. And every time you think that you have an air gap, you find that there's some kind of secondary connection that kind of breaks that gap, right? But if we can manage and control that flow of information, that provides us a lot of opportunities to say, you know what, IT's a mess. We get it. It's fine. But even if you get compromised, you can't hurt me, right? And that's kind of the stance that we need to take. When we're building these OT environments, we almost have to treat IT just like another internet.
Sure.
So thinking about the advances now that we're starting to see in the ability to automate things, right? Like we've never been able to do before. And to me, I always get concerned, like, what if one little thing is off, right, on your automation and you're missing something? How do you see that role of, like, we call it AI, right, like really advanced machine learning? How do you see that now affecting kind of the OT, maybe even being able to solve some of the problems between OT and IoT? Is there anything there that you're seeing coming up?
Yeah, so and this too affects, and I'm going to get to your question in a minute, but I want to speak to this as it relates to
Sure.
security controls, because I think it's important for us to think about how we secure these environments, right? More active and automated security controls that take actions on our behalf without human interaction, that's acceptable on the IT side of the house because we can tolerate a certain degree of failure. We have zero tolerance for failure in these OT systems. That's why you typically will not see like an intrusion prevention system. Like people don't deploy IPSs in these environments because if the IPS gets something wrong, the signature is wrong, we make a wrong action and then we cause a problem and we do not have the time to recover from that failure, and we can have catastrophic cascading failures on the OT side and physical impacts from just a security control that didn't do what it was supposed to do. But again, going back to the CrowdStrike issue, right? We had multiple like engineering workstations and HMIs, Windows-based systems in the OT environment that were impacted by this CrowdStrike issue. This is an IT managed product, right? That created impact in the OT environment. I don't care that it was a security product, right? That is meaningless to me from the standpoint of understanding like that kind of connection between the two and how that creates some challenges for us. But I think you had a bigger question there, and I think I missed the first part of your question. You mind kind of
No, it's okay. I was
I
just curious if you're seeing, I think you answered a lot of it, actually. It sounds like if we do integrate AI into anything in the OT
AI,
space, it's got to be specific to maybe a couple, only a specific domain area, but like there's certain domain areas that just are not ready for anything like that because of the potential for catastrophic events. But maybe could there be some segmentation where you separate it and this now kind of we run this AI in this part of the environment to help improve X, but this other area is completely separate. I don't know. Is that something you're seeing happening?
Yeah, I mean, we're certainly seeing opportunities for AI to solve many of our challenges for us, but there's also a lot of trepidation around fully automating these processes without a human in the loop, right? The reality is when we talk about like the scalability of some of these challenges, especially when we get into like kind of our green energy infrastructure and kind of expansions from solar and wind and some of these other things, electric vehicle charging infrastructure, this is creating dramatic expansion of our grid infrastructure, right? And in many instances, many untrusted elements, right, that are coming into play. You talk about IoT. There's often a lot of IoT in your EVCI infrastructure. Think about your Tesla chargers and all this, right? Like all that infrastructure that's coming into play. And many times, some of this infrastructure is managed by third parties, and we have untrusted assets that need to connect with us and do things, and all that comes into play. And like when we think about things like demand patterns, like energy demand patterns based off of weather conditions or time of year or some of these other factors, this is a really good opportunity for AI to help us to do some really sophisticated modeling to understand, like, for instance, like electricity demand, right? Like electricity demand is not static. It changes, and there's a lot of other factors. And we need sophisticated systems to do modeling and help us understand these things. But so too is the potential for manipulation of that data, manipulation of those models. And so if we're automatically changing, like spinning up and spinning down electric power generation and transmission based off of our projected and predictive demand based off of AI modeling, what happens when that AI model gets tainted and then we don't produce enough electricity? What happens then, right? Is it just we don't have enough, there's no power at the Tesla charger, or is the manufacturing facility next door going to suffer a brownout or a blackout, right? Like how does all that work? What are the decisions that we're actually making using AI? How do they influence us? And I do a lot of work in the secure by design space, and I'm a strong advocate for a methodology out of the Department of Energy called cyber informed engineering. And one of the core principles in CIE is around planned failure, right? Like we have to assume that failure is going to occur. How do we plan for that failure? How do we fail gracefully? When over-reliance on digital systems creates risk for us, do we have the ability to fall back to manual operations? Think about the ransomware threat, right? Like if I have a computer control process with no ability to run it manually and it gets ransomware, what do I do now? Like what happens if the boiler's about to explode and the computer program that cuts the fuel to the operation that's causing heat or causing a problem in the boiler is completely computer controlled, and that computer program is now completely nullified by like a ransomware or malware threat? Like what do you do then? If I don't have like some sort of e-stop switch on the wall that a human can go hit the switch and say, whoa, process got to stop. We got to stop this or we're going to have a catastrophe, right? We have to build in these mechanisms. And AI doesn't account for those things, right? Like the thing that I have seen with kind of the expansion of AI, and AI is not necessarily a new thing, but our usage of AI is a new thing. And certainly kind of the global adoption and the ease of which this is happening. My own experience with AI is it's really great for large scale, low confidence tasks, right? And even like I'm sure some of the creatives out there would argue that it's completely destroying their world with like AI generated art and things like that. But the reality is when we think about like the really important critical functions, the things that cannot fail, I don't think we really want an AI with a confidence level that may be less than 99 to 100%, making those decisions autonomously for us. That's a recipe for disaster.
And even to your point, like some of the challenges that go beyond just that is once you connect these capabilities to your network, right, your attack surface increases. And not always is that risk understood. Is that risk calculated? Is it measured? There's mitigating controls. It's tested, right? You were kind of talking about testing. And that's something that I'm starting to see more be picked up by companies that are not necessarily in the industrial space, but they have OT or IoT capabilities, and they're starting to become more aware of the risks these devices pose to them. And I'm seeing that through the lens of IT, right? So you've got these IT programs with these security leaders that are now saying, all right, what else is on our network, right? What should be segmented, right? When they see, I can't tell you how many times I see Windows like XP still out there tied to some OT device. And to a security professional, the first response is, all right, remove internet access, and segment this thing away, all right? But you have to go beyond that, right? You have to look at what's the long-term roadmap of that device. Is anyone going to ever update that code, right? Is there new code that can be used to do that same function that could be supported? And I think those are some of the challenges that I see. You don't have like a universal like coding language, right? So who knows how each of these different types of devices are coded, what protocols are used, what you already brought up, encryption or other type of services that can make sure the confidentiality and integrity of that data is being protected, right? And then on top of that, to your point, we're converging by combining these things onto IT networks. So I don't think the risk is necessarily new. I think it's just converging as more things are internet accessible. And we're seeing these now and learning these now after after attacks happen, and there's examples now to replicate. But one thing that I definitely wanted to ask you is, where do you see this going from a framework perspective, right? Do you ever see in the future a framework for like OT or IoT or even a combination with IT to not only create these types of devices and have a certain secure by design and certain standards in terms of process and testing and all that, but then even frameworks that can support them in operation?
Yeah, I think that you're touching on one of the biggest challenges in the space right now, and that is around the harmonization of control frameworks, right? We have so much guidance out there, and most of it is either industry specific or technology specific, and it's kind of all over the place. And especially when you look at and don't get me wrong, there's a lot of really great work coming out of NIST and CISA and these other government organizations. But even though we're getting really good guidance out of them, it doesn't always align. And the volume of content that's coming out is so fast and furious that asset owners are drowning in all this guidance that's coming at them, and they don't even know what to do with it all. It's really frustrating for most people that are trying to figure out, like, okay, great, you produced 100 documents in the last year. Which one is the most important for me to look at? I don't spend all day like reading white papers and control frameworks. Like, I have a job to do, right? Like, and especially when you look at like the small to medium size operators, right? Some of them don't even have dedicated cybersecurity teams. Like, who is going to process all this information and do anything with it? Just give me the simple. Just give me the basics of what I need to do. Now, this is why I like things like the CISA's cybersecurity performance goals or the cross-sector cybersecurity performance goals. It's not an exhaustive framework, but it's a simplified approach to saying, like, let's just go from 0 to 1. We're not going like from 0 to 60 here. We're just going from 0 to 1. We're just trying to get something in place, a foundational, what industry pundits like Dale Peterson refers to as the floor. It's the security floor. Like, what is the absolute baseline that everyone needs to be at? I think it's 38 controls or so. It's not super exhaustive, but it calls for things like multi-factor authentication. We're supposed to have that, and validation that security vulnerabilities are being resolved and that we have a responsible entity for security and things like this. Very foundational things. This is absolutely where we need to get to. But we look at like what came out in the National Cybersecurity Strategy this year. One of the key goals, at least within the U.S. federal government, is harmonization of all these controls. It's well understood that there's too much just nonsense out there that is really hard for people to wrap their brains around. I think where people have very well understood industry specific frameworks, like for instance, electric power. I do a lot of work in electric power. NERC-CIP is the prevailing compliance regulatory framework with extreme financial penalties for failure. And quite frankly, a lot of electric power organizations are building their cybersecurity programs completely around this framework. And then everything else is just kind of like nice to haves, right? As people are kind of on both sides of that, whether that's a good approach or a not good approach. And I won't get into the whole topic of whether compliance is good, evil, or indifferent. But if you work in electric power, you know what NERC-CIP is. It's well understood. This is what it is. This is what we need to do. There's not a lot of ambiguity there. You don't get that as much in other industries that don't have such a harsh regime of regulatory frameworks. I could choose. Do I do ISO? Do I do NIST? Do I do this other thing? Do I create my own thing? If I create my own thing, what am I pulling from? Am I pulling from like the Australian controls, or am I pulling from CIS, or am I pulling from DISA-STIGs or whatever, right? Like, all this stuff can come into play, and it can be a really hard problem to wrap our brains around. But I firmly believe that we are going to arrive at something. Whether it actually scratches the itch or not, I'm not necessarily convinced of yet, but I think we will get at something that kind of aggregates some of this guidance in meaningful ways. Again, because that was one of the key strategies one of the key initiatives for the National Cybersecurity Strategy. But I think it's too early to see where that's going to go. And again, this is a U.S.-centric thing. And quite frankly, we are in a global economy. A lot of, especially when you look at a lot of the OT vendors, a lot of the big OT vendors are not U.S.-based, right? Like Schneider Electric, that's not a U.S. company, right? They sell into the U.S., they sell into Europe. And I think we also have to look at things like the Cyber Resilience Act, CRA is going to drive a lot of changes, especially when we talk about manufacturing and any kind of manufacturing products that are then sold into the EU, which is a lot, right? I think that's going to drive a lot of change in our industry too.
Well, we're getting to the end of our time, Tony. I want to definitely hear, just lastly, how you're making a contribution to this industry with OpsWright. And I know you provide a variety of services, but maybe just quickly, if you can highlight kind of the software that you've built and how that applies to maybe small to medium-sized companies and how they can utilize that and get in touch with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that, Jesse. So we started the company a couple of years ago as a means to productize the consequence-driven cyber-informed engineering methodology out of Idaho National Labs, which is one of the labs under one of the research and development laboratories under Department of Energy. And we were trying to tackle this kind of big problem of understanding, like, okay, let's look at these OT environments. Let's identify the consequences of failure. Let's figure out what's important, identify the critical functions, and all the things that go feed into those critical functions that create risk for us. And that's precisely what we have built. So what we have built is a software solution that provides very comprehensive cyber asset context through the form of dependency management, dependency mapping. So a lot of times we talk about dependencies. We're talking about like software dependencies, and I do a lot of work in software supply chain and SBOM, and wrote a book on the topic. So it's certainly something I talk about a lot, right? But that's not what I'm talking about here. When I say dependencies, I'm talking about all the things that go into your critical function. Think like business continuity or business impact analysis, right? Like, I have a mission, a reason why my company exists. What are all the things I need to do the thing? And assets are part of it, systems are part of it, but so are people. So are resources. Power coming out of the wall, chemical supplied for my chemical treatment operation in the water facility, right? What happens if I don't have any more chemicals to treat the water? Well, then I can't treat the water, right? I got power, I got to have water, I have people, I have to third parties, I have other processes, I have other functions, enabling functions to support my critical functions. So we do all that mapping and modeling to provide a cyber asset context to help organizations figure out, like, what should I be working on? What are the biggest risks in my organization? And map it all back in a more business-friendly way of kind of looking at the risk management process. So you can find us OpsWright.com, OpsWright.com. I'm very active on LinkedIn. You can follow me there. I'm very easy to find. You can reach out to us there. We are in a closed beta currently, so the product is not GA yet. We are in a closed beta. We have active beta participants, both from asset owners and engineering firms that we're engaged with. We are largely focused on critical infrastructure, but the way we've built things, it would be applicable to other environments as well. But feel free to reach out and get in touch, and happy to walk you through it.
That's great. Well, Tony, thank you so much. This was very informative. Very helpful, and wow, yeah, I mean, just like so many different areas I saw crossover with. So we really appreciate your time. Thanks for joining us on the show today, and we hope your talk can really help in securing the future for many of those out there that are listening. Have a great rest of your day, and thanks so much.
All right, thanks, Jesse and Ramin.
Thanks, Tony.